Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session in our course called Who Wrote the Bible? In this session and in our next session, we're going to look at the New Testament and especially the Gospels. This session will look at the four traditional Gospels, the Gospels that people associate with the New Testament. And next week, we'll look at other Gospels that some people contend should be in the New Testament. So this week, we focus on the traditional view that there are four Gospels. And let's look at a traditional view. I say a traditional view because there are some discussions going on specifically about who wrote what when. But most traditional scholars agree that these witnesses, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, are eyewitnesses of Jesus. That is, Matthew and John were both disciples of Jesus, traveled with him. Luke was a companion of Paul and got information from Paul and other apostles during their travels. And Mark was the companion of Peter and got his information from Peter. So most traditional scholars would hold that these are the original writers and compilers of the four gospels as we have them. And what all the traditional views share in common is that these are historical accounts. They weren't written later, they weren't mythology, they weren't thinking back about history and imagining what it was like. No, these were eyewitness accounts by people very close to the scene. These are historical witnesses to the ministry, the actions, the words of Jesus himself. So if we look at this little chart we put together, you can see the time frame that we're talking about. We assume Jesus died somewhere around 33 AD, and we assume the last gospel, which is probably that of John, written somewhere around 90 AD, you see there's a space of about 57 years in which these gospels are written. And we have a little marker there for 70 AD because that's a significant event in Jewish history. That's the year that Rome destroys the temple in Jerusalem. And so often when scholars are looking at when a particular gospel was written, they try to discern if in the pages of the gospels we can tell whether the temple was still standing when it was written or had the Romans already destroyed it. And there's some controversy about that. But generally speaking, most traditional scholars will believe that Mark is probably the first gospel and was probably composed before the temple fell, somewhere in that area of 65 or 70, perhaps earlier. But that becomes the starting, it's the shortest gospel, the fewest words, a very direct account. Then with Matthew and Luke, we have an expanded account. It seems that they're using some of the same material that Mark uses. They share material between them, and then they each have some of their own unique material. So those seem to be expanded accounts, probably written after Mark. And the last gospel, John, it's an entirely different creation. He's writing from scratch. He puts together a very theological organization of the material. So there's four different views of the same historical events. So again, we're talking about all four of the Gospels having been written by the end of the first century, within, say, 60 or less years of the death of Jesus. So that's kind of a basic traditional view. So let's talk about why this view was held, or this type of view was held for so many centuries, and it has to do with the witnesses to these traditions. Let's look first at the manuscript evidence. What manuscripts of these Gospels do we have? And let's just start off with an admission. I guess there's bad news and good news. The bad news is we don't have any original documents. That is, we don't have the paper that Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John wrote on. We don't have their first drafts, as it were. What we have is copies of copies of copies spaced throughout the centuries. Now that sounds like bad news. It would be great if we had the originals. But maybe we would put those in a museum somewhere and worship the text instead of the meaning. I don't know. But maybe the bad news is that we don't have the original. But the good news is we have thousands and thousands of manuscripts that scholars who know what they're doing can sort through these manuscripts and make some decisions. Some families and groups of manuscripts look more reliable than others. You can see how maybe the text was corrupted over time, different phrases added or changed. And through all this comparison and cross analysis, we can get to the core. What is it that they share in common? What is probably there in the original? And I would say probably within that 90% range, we're very, very accurate of probably very accurate of what the original was like. So even though we don't have the original documents, we come pretty close to them because of the ability to look at these thousands of documents that we have over time. But with that preface in mind, let's look at a couple of the oldest fragments that we have, the oldest witnesses to what the text looked like. Now, all of these fragments, or most of them, I should say, but most of the most important ones, are written on a material called papyri. It's a pressed reed that is pressed together and forms a kind of paper that's written on with some sort of stylus or ink. And some of those papyri documents, they last very well, especially in Egypt and some of the other drier climates in the desert places. They withstand for much time and wear. But these are fragments mostly, and it takes a lot of science and a lot of art to piece them together into documents. But I wanted to point out a couple of those fragments, the oldest ones that we have, and the most remarkable to these witnesses of the gospel. And the first one is this document called P52, and the P there stands for papyrus. That's why they're numbered. They're numbered by scholars who have assigned these over the years so that everybody knows which papyri fragment we're talking about. So P52, an innocuous kind of name, but it's a very powerful witness. It's the earliest document we have probably of the New Testament. Some scholars make other claims for different fragments, but most at this point would agree that this is the earliest piece of the gospel that we have. It's a very small fragment, just a few centimeters high and wide. It contains just a few phrases from John chapter 18, where Jesus is interviewing Pilate. And most scholars would assign this to somewhere in the area of 125 or 150 AD. Again, some disagreement, but that's the majority opinion. And think about that if it's true. If John was written somewhere around 90 AD, within 35 years of it being written, it's now being preserved somewhere in Egypt. This document was found in Egypt. So think about that. Within 35 years, the Gospel of John was written. We have this witness, this fragment that says it was written, and it was thought of enough that it was copied and found in Egypt within that or copied and found its way into Egypt, where it was discovered in the 1920s. So obviously, this gospel had a great deal of authority and a great deal of respect if it traveled so far so fast. Currently, it's located in Manchester, England. It's a significant message. One of the great New Testament scholars of our generation, unfortunately passed now, his name Bruce Metzger, did a lot of work with these manuscripts. In fact, I have a quote here from this textbook called The Text of the New Testament. I'd encourage you, if you're really interested in this, that would be the book to get and read through how we piece through those manuscripts. But there's an interesting quote in that text. Metzger says about this particular fragment from John. It says, although the extent of the verses preserved is so slight, in one respect, this tiny scrap of papyrus possesses quite as much evidential values as would a complete codex. And just to be clear, that word codex, it talks about a book. Up until this point, we've been talking about scrolls. We talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example. But codex is now putting these writings into book form. And it's saying what Metzger's telling us is this tiny scrap from a book, there's a lot of evidential value there. Even if we had the whole book, it would certainly be great. But this little scrap says a lot in and of itself. He explains, he uses this comparison, says, just as Robinson Crusoe, seeing but a single footprint in the sand, concluded that another human being with 2 feet was present on the island with him, so P52 proves the existence and use of the fourth gospel during the first half of the 2nd century in a provincial town along the Nile, far removed from its traditional place of composition. That's Ephesus in Asia Minor. We would think of that as Turkey. So think about John wrote in Turkey, and this scrap made it all the way down along the Nile River in Egypt. Had this little fragment been known in the middle of the last century, that is, we're talking about the 1800s now, at the time that Metzger wrote this, so we talked about the 1800s. He says, had this little fragment been known in the middle of the last century, that school of New Testament criticism, which was inspired by the brilliant Tübingen scholar Ferdinand Christian Bauer, could not have argued that the fourth gospel was not composed until the year 160. What Metzger is saying here is that in the 18th century and then certainly into the 19th century, schools began to grow, arguing that these four gospels were written much later than we thought. Bauer was one of the founding groups of this modern movement that said these gospels were written much later. They were written alongside other gospels that we're going to talk about next week. But Metzger is saying, look, this little scrap of paper proves that that was an incorrect guess. It can't be true, because here we found a scrap of John's gospel before 125, 150. So it could not have been written up later than that. It had been, in fact, written much earlier than that, copied, and sent all the way to Egypt. So that little piece of evidence is very, very strong for us as we think about when these gospels were written. Now, this is the Gospel of John. What about the other gospels? Well, we have these two little fragments, and they come from different places, and they're kind of grouped together. Some would put P4 with this, but they're fragments from Matthew. Just tiny fragments. Again, it would be nice if we had the whole codex, all of Matthew, but these little fragments tell us that by 200 AD, also traveling far, these gospels were already recognized. So 200 AD from Matthew, again, if we're talking maybe 65, 70, this is still, 130 years within the writing. This was preserved, copied, and carried all the way into the South. So this is another little fragment to show that these gospels were copied and circulated early. And the last one we'll look at is an important papyri called P45. So just 50 years later. So this is now about a little less than 200 years since the original documents were written, more or less. But the significance of this particular papyri is that it has fragments from all four Gospels as well as the book of Acts. So another important early witness to show that all four Gospels had these copies. And what we're going to find next week is these other Gospels do not have this kind of manuscript evidence. They don't have all this from so ancient a time. And we'll compare that next week. So when people talk about these gospels been written later and people pretending to be John, Matthew, Mark, Luke, it's important to understand that we're not believing that based upon no evidence. We have manuscripts here that date within 100 years and less of the time that documents were written. We have physical evidence showing that they were copied and circulated far away as Egypt. So these documents are very important witnesses in the sand, if you will, to the early date of these four Gospels. So those are the primary fragments. Now, what about whole copies of the Bible? How do we get to those? Let me just say that prior to some of the recent findings, the oldest copy we have in the Old Testament and some of the New Testament dated to the Middle Ages. But we found a couple works here, this Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, in the last 100 years or so, that really turned scholarship around and really gave us a closer look at what these New Testament passages look like. And the first one I want to talk about is this text called Vaticanus. Now, these are different kind of documents. They're not on papyrus anymore. They're on what we call vellum or treated leather of various types. And they're written in capital letters, large unsealed letters, they're called. And these capital letters, that's why when we look at the numbering system, they have the capital letter A or the capital letter B. It's because they're using these capital letters. Now, this particular one, Vaticanus, as you might imagine, is in the Vatican Library. It has been around actually since the Renaissance. Erasmus talks about it, but we weren't really sure what we had until it was dug through and evaluated and really understood. Well, Vaticanus is one of those amazing documents that actually it preserves most of the New Testament, all the Gospels. Here we have a picture of the end of Thessalonians, beginning of Hebrews. It is missing some of Paul's letters, and it is missing the book of Revelation, but the Gospels are there. And it gives us a look of what the Gospels looked like around the year 300 AD. Again, we're not that far removed. We're only a couple hundred years from when John was written, maybe 250 years from some of the other Gospels. So we're still very, very close to when the Gospels were there. And here we found this entire copy from around 300 AD to show that these Gospels were very, very revered and respected. Now, keep in mind that to produce a vellum book like this, it was very, very expensive. The average person couldn't own this. I mean, the cost of this may have been a single worker's salary for his entire lifetime. So this is a very, very treasured document. A lot of dollars, a lot of time, a lot of money expended to produce these beautiful vellum manuscripts of the gospel. This tells us within 200 years, 250 years, there was such a demand for these gospels that they were copied out in full at great expense. These were highly revered. Now, in addition to the New Testament, by the way, the Vaticanus also has the Old Testament. So we can look at that as well and see what that text was like. So it's giving us a new insight. It's the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament is there. It gives an insight of what the document, the New Testament, which was originally written in Greek, what it looked like at the year 300. Another important document is something called Sinaiticus. It's called Sinaiticus because it was discovered, if you will, in the Sinai Peninsula at Mount Catherine's monastery there. Found or discovered, if you will, or at least brought into the modern world by a guy by the name of Tischendorf. The story is kind of legendary about how he goes to that monastery the first time and supposedly sees these old manuscripts ready for the trash heap and goes and rescues them and borrows them, if you will. And when he realizes what he has, he comes back and gets more. At one point, we hear the story that he was so enamored with what he found, he couldn't sleep through the night until he read through them and tried to understand them. And the story goes on about him trying to secure those and get copies at this point for the Tsar of Russia, who was underwriting some of his trips. There's some disputes from the monastery itself about those events, so there's still some controversy around all that. But the bottom line is this particular document turns out to be incredibly important. It's within 30 years of the Vaticanus, and when we compare this document with the Vaticanus document, we see so many similarities. They were clearly highly, they were produced with a high degree of accuracy. Where they are in sync, we're very, very close to knowing what the original was. In fact, there's kind of a saying in this biblical scholarship world that between Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, those are called the heavenly twins. And that little mark, I said they're all about capital letters. The capital letter there is the capital letter Aleph. That's in the Hebrew alphabet. That's why it has that character next to it for Sinaiticus. And so the saying says, when Aleph and B agree, we're so close to the originals. So those become very, very important manuscripts in discerning what the real text of the Bible looks like. Very impressive. By the way, this manuscript is openly available. You can see it. I saw it. You just go into the British Library and it's in a beautiful display case there. I remember going to London and going into that library and seeing that. I was so excited to see the Sinaiticus, and within a couple hundred years of the books being written. It was quite a moving experience. I remember calling Liz and telling her, hey, I can't believe it. I saw the Sinaiticus. And she kind of said, I think I'm the only wife in the world that got this phone call. So I guess it's a little weird thing for me, but it was so exciting to see this document. It's right there. Now, this is very important to us because it helps us correct a lot of maybe corruptions that came into older manuscripts. Where we see this most often is in the King James Version. The King James Version of the Bible was based upon manuscripts that were not quite as reliable as Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. They were based on a group of, primarily upon a manuscript called Beza. It has the capital letter D. And while it's a good manuscript, there are some pieces in there that probably weren't part of the original. They were scribal insertions over time. So, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, when you get to the end of the Lord's Prayer, we usually say, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen." That's how we end the Lord's Prayer. Well, in the King James, that phrase is there. But you'll see in the newer translations, that particular phrase is relegated to a footnote. Why? Well, because in Sinaiticus and in Vaticanus, that particular phrase is missing. And it seems like that latter phrase was probably added to make it more liturgical, to make it something we could say in church, added by a monk at some point as a footnote that eventually gets incorporated into the text. So sometimes I get questions and concerns that these newer versions of the Bible take stuff out. Well, that's not really what's happening. What's happening is these newer versions, like the NIV and the TNEV and some of these others, the ESV, some of these newer translations are just taking advantage of more accurate translations or more accurate manuscripts of the Bible that get us a little closer to the original. So that's why the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus are very important. And there's one more I'll talk to you about. It's a manuscript called Alexandrinus, obviously found in Alexandria, now again located in the British Library. You can see this. It's right in the same room with the Sinaiticus. I saw this too. It's a beautiful, beautiful document. Just an amazing, amazing production. That just the amount of time and money that went into this. Missing most of Matthew. But we're now at about 400 AD, so we're now about 300 years removed, 300 plus, 350 years, 40 years, 310 years, something like that from the writings. But it's just another example of all of the Gospels. Now, it's missing most of Matthew, but clearly had all the Gospels. So these four Gospels have abundant evidence to suggest that they were the ones that New Testament Christians were looking at for centuries. Those were the authoritative ones, that large numbers stretching all the way from Turkey, we now know as Turkey, that area, Asia Minor, into Jerusalem and that area, and then all the way down into Egypt. So there's a geographical scattering of these to show that these documents bear witness to the four Gospels as we have them. So let's look at a few historical comparisons. As I said, if we'll start at the bottom line and then we'll work back up in this little chart. Now, what we said is the dates were written somewhere between 50, I think I said in the earlier slide, 65, depending upon where you're coming from, to somewhere around 90. So within that 40-year period, these books were written, or 35 years. And notice what we have here. Like the earliest manuscripts we have is from 125 AD. So that's within 35 years or so when the book was actually written. We have a fragment to show that was written there. By the year 200 AD, we have books of the Bible, whole books of the Bible. So that's within 100 plus years of the original writing. By the year 250 AD, we have most of the New Testament, copies of those. So we're within 150 years of the original writing. We have most of the New Testament. And by 325 AD, we have a whole complete New Testament in those codexes we went over. So we have quite a lot of evidence within the first 200 years or so of these writings. And in total, what I put there on the far right is that we have over 5,700. I read an article the other day that we're probably up over 5,800 now, manuscripts over the, I'd say, the 1,000 years since Christ has been here, and 230 of those from before 600 AD. So there's a lot of manuscripts being compared and contrasted for us to figure out what was in those original writings. And what you see above is some of the other documents that people regard as historic. So, for example, Homer, his Iliad, right back in the day, some of us read the Iliad and the Odyssey from Homer. He was writing somewhere around 800 BC. There's a lot of controversy about that, but somewhere around 800 BC. The earliest manuscript we have of Homer's Iliad is from 400 years later, from 400 BC. And we only have 643 copies. So what you and I are reading as the Iliad, this is based on very slim evidentiary evidence, very slim evidence from 400 years later and a limited number of copies that do disagree with one another. So what was the original text of the Iliad? And Plato's even in a worse situation. We read the philosophy of Plato, but he wrote somewhere around 400 BC. As far as I know, and I'm able to check, the earliest manuscript we have of Plato's writing comes from 1300 years later. It's from the Middle Ages. And we only have 7 copies of that, and yet we read Plato's document as if we're reading Plato. So compared to these 2 documents, and we could put a few other things up here, but these are kind of, I think, the most striking. Compared to that, the New Testament has so much more evidence for it. In fact, again, if we go back to our good friend Bruce Metzger here, he tells us that, he tells us, I think it's here. Yeah, the textual critic of the New Testament is embarrassed by the wealth of material. In other words, when he sits down to figure out what did the original authors write, there's just so much material, it takes a lifetime to master. So we're so thankful for the scholars like Metzger and others who have worked so hard to work through this material so that we have an accurate view, as accurate as we can tell, of those early New Testament writings. So let's just talk a little bit about some possible responses when folks ask us, why these 4 Gospels? Why are we focused on these 4 Gospels? Why do we insist that they are the ones that bear historical witness to Jesus? Well, the first point, just to summarize, the fact that we have over 5,700 or 5,800 New Testament Greek manuscripts widely distributed for 1,000 years, over 230 manuscripts within 500 years, it indicates that these works were highly regarded and respected among early believers. These are the works, these are the 4 Gospels that are repeated and circulated throughout the whole geographic area. Those are the ones that dominate the landscape. Obviously, there's some reason why these 4 Gospels are regarded more highly than other documents. And the fact that we have complete copies of New Testament books by the middle of the 4th century argues that these works were widely known and respected by that day. See, in some contemporary interpretations, it is argued that it's probably somewhere in the 4th century, the early 300 ADs, or maybe even at the Council of Nicaea in 325, that scholars came together or church leaders came together and decided which books would be in the New Testament. They picked this one, this one, and this one, but rejected that one and that one and that one. That's the current kind of popular theory out there about how the New Testament got decided. But what the evidence shows us, the manuscript evidence shows us, is no, by the time this happens in those early 300s, the decision had already been made. They're just repeating a decision that has been passed down from generation to generation, clearly from the 2nd century on, like right after these documents were written. There was a belief, an assumption that these books were the authoritative books. These were the ones that were copied and circulated. So when we get to the 300s and church leaders are making these lists, clearly they're following a tradition already in place. They didn't just start with a blank sheet and to go through and decide which books are in. No, there's a long tradition of which books are to be trusted and believed. And this is supported by the wide diversity of copies in geographic locations. Enable scholars to construct it with a high degree of accuracy. We made that point that it's precisely because we have so many and we're able to compare one against the other, dispersed all over the Mediterranean area, the whole ancient Roman Empire. By comparing all those, we get a good cross section, and we can, with a high degree of accuracy, determine what was at the core, what was part of the original. And as we pointed out, as documents go, we're much more certain of New Testament texts than we are of other ancient historical texts. So those are some conclusions based upon manuscripts. Now let's go forward and we'll talk a little bit about some early witnesses. Outside of these Gospels documents, what are some other witnesses we have? Well, the truth is, scholars claim that just by looking at some of the citations of the New Testament from early Christian writers, we could essentially reconstruct the New Testament just based on the quotations that we find in early witnesses early on. So I want to point out just a few of the important early witnesses. This is a whole course by itself. I'd love to do it in more depth at some point. But this gives you a few ideas of people that were talking about the New Testament and saying things about the four Gospels very early on the process. So let me start with the New Testament itself. We have this very interesting statement in Luke chapter 1. He says, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught." Now, we don't know who this Theophilus is. We don't know if it's a code name, if it's an actual name. Apparently, an early leader or early, perhaps a Roman leader in a household somewhere, maybe having been taught as a Christian, a believer. We're not sure. But Luke is writing this and dedicating to him. And he says very clearly, many have undertaken. So the truth is, even by Luke's time, there have been a lot of folks writing, a lot of people compiling accounts of what happened with Jesus. It's interesting that his stands out as one of the four that were accepted over time. Why is that? Why is it that his writing, among many, according to him, many people have been writing stuff? Where are those accounts from that period of time? Why is his accepted? And by the way, why Luke? I mean, if you were going to fake a gospel and kind of want to write later, why would you choose the name Luke? I mean, Luke was not one of the original disciples. He was a follower of Paul. And yet, for some reason, his gospel was accepted, copied, and circulated all over the world. Why? Because what he says is the truth. He's been researching these things. These are original eyewitness accounts. He wants to get things right. There seems to be, from a very early date, this desire to record what really happened, to record fact. If you're going to risk your life to defend this story in front of the Roman government, in front of other authorities, if you're going to risk your life, you want to make sure you're doing it based upon fact. What really happened? Not based upon a mythology, but based upon fact. This is an attempt to give us facts, to give Theophilus facts, to record this facts. And Luke knows, as a doctor, as a physician, he wants to write this down and compile this so that we have an historical record. And actually, some of you probably know this, many of you probably know this. I just want to point out that Acts is a continuation of the book of Luke. The start of Acts, it says, "In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote all about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up to heaven." Luke Acts are really volume 1 and 2 of this history that Luke was writing. So again, focused on history, what really happened. We want accurate accounts. If you read through Luke's gospel, it's very interesting that he has material in there about Mary, what Mary was thinking. We think perhaps he even interviewed Mary personally. And he traveled with Paul and interacted with Paul and followed Paul to all these different places and interviewed these folks. So this is somebody who's trying to give us actual facts. There's another interesting quote about these sources here in the Gospel of John, the last Gospel. He says, "Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book." So John is saying, I could have written a lot more, but I didn't write everything. But I wrote these that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Again, this conviction that what he's seeking to do is give us historical fact, because he wants faith, this belief in Jesus, not to be based upon presumption, not to be based on theory, but to lay down the facts that are essential for us to know the truth. So that seems to be the impetus in the New Testament writings as we have them. And it's important to note this because that idea to get back to the facts, get back to the history, that idea carries forward into the next generation. Let's look at the writings of this individual named Papias. Now, Papias is an interesting New Testament personage. We know about him mainly through a work later written by an author called Eusebius. So in the 4th century, wrote an early church history. It's a fascinating book. If you really want to know what happened in those first couple centuries, you can go online right now and find Eusebius's church history. It's a very interesting read. And not history the way we would read it, but very interesting stories in there. But he tells us about this individual named Papias. Now, Papias wrote a book. Apparently, we don't have the actual book, but it's quoted extensively in Eusebius and in other places, called the Oracles of Our Lord. Writings that he's recording, things that the Lord said. Some believe that it may have even been in Aramaic, but we have the quotations are in Greek. And later in Latin. So this is Eusebius's take on it, and so he quotes extensively this work called "The Oracles of Our Lord" by Papias, and Papias is dated around 100 A.D. In other words, he's the first generation after the disciples. And according to the traditions we read about from Eusebius and others, Papias was apparently a friend of a person, or an acquaintance at least, of a person called Polycarp, who was intimate with the Apostle John. And Papias may have known the Apostle John himself personally. So the statements go, or the theories go. In other words, Papias is one generation removed from the actual apostles. And look what he writes in his book on the Lord's sayings. He says, if that anyone who had attended on the elders came, I asked minutely after their sayings, what Andrew or Peter said, or what was said by Philip or Thomas, or by James, or by John, or by Matthew, or by any other of the Lord's disciples. Which things did Aristion and the presbyter John, the disciples of the Lord, say? In other words, other people who are not necessarily disciples, but they're other people that follow Jesus. They knew Jesus too. The disciples of the Lord say, for I imagined that what was to be got from books was not so profitable to me as what came from the living and abiding voice. Papias is in some ways saying what Luke has already said, that there are many accounts out there, many books being written about what Jesus did and said. But what Papias is saying is, I want the actual conversations. What did Jesus really say? And what Papias says in the long run is that these are the things that Jesus really said, the things that he's capturing and that are later found themselves into the Gospels. We see this same kind of thought about 100 years later in this person called Irenaeus. Now, Irenaeus is a colorful figure. He was a church leader, a bishop, even in southern France by now. The Christianity has made itself there within 100 years or so after John's writings. So Irenaeus is writing, and sometimes his comments are very, very strident. He wrote this book called Against Heresies. It's not kind at all to those who disagreed. It probably should have been written with a little more love in it. But still, you read through it and you hear this conviction, this inner conviction. Listen to this interesting statement. He says, the Gospels could not possibly be either more or less in number than they are. Since there are 4 zones of the world in which we live and 4 principal winds, he's talking about north, south, east, west. While the church is spread all over the earth, it is fittingly has 4 pillars, everywhere breathing out incorruption and revivifying men. Interesting theory that there are 4 directions, north, south, east, wind, west, that take us all over the earth. Interesting theory. There can only be 4 gospels. We might not have some question or concern about the theory, but what this tells us is that around 200 AD, there's a strong assumption already that there are only 4 gospels. So these other works that are coming along pretending to be gospels, no, there's already a strong movement in the church to say, no, these are the 4. These are the 4 that tell us truth. These are the 4s that are recorded. These are the pillars on which we base our faith. And then later he says, in that same work, he says, now the gospels in which Christ is enthroned are like these. Matthew proclaims his human birth, Mark takes his beginning from the prophetic spirit who comes on men from on high. According to Luke, as having priestly character. For that, according to John, expounds his princely and mighty and glorious birth from the Father. Again, this belief that by 200, it's these four Gospels that are giving us our image and picture of the historical Christ from different perspectives, to be sure, but they are actual historical witness to who Jesus was. So those are just two early uh, writers within the first 100+ years of the writing of these Gospels that are saying these are the authoritative ones. These are the ones that should be accepted as reliable witnesses. Let me also point to one additional person. We have time for one more. It's an individual by the name of Athanasius. Now, Athanasius was a very uh, interesting character, strong leader from Alexandria in Egypt. At this particular time in the history of the church, there were different centers of church authority. Rome was one, Jerusalem was one, but also you had a strong leadership in Turkey, that area, and a strong leadership also in Alexandria in Egypt. Strong Christian center. And Athanasius was one of the foremost world leaders at that point. In fact, he goes to council in Nicaea in 325 and helps to sort through this challenge of other beliefs about Christianity. And he is the first one that we have that gives us the list of New Testament books as we currently have them, the 27 books we currently have in our New Testament. And he says in his Easter letter in the 4th century, 367 AD, he says, "It seemed good to me also, having been urged thereto by true brethren, and having learned from the beginning to set before you the books included in the canon, as handed down and accredited as divine." And if you read through there, that's when he lists the books out. And you can, again, find that online and read that for yourself. But the key here is that Athanasius is really the first one to use this word canon to apply to the list of books in the Bible. It's the official list, if you were, the official rule of what books should be included. But the important thing about his list is he's not just creating it from scratch. He's not saying this is a new thing that I came up with. This is my proposal. This is my theory that I'd like to be debated. No. If you read that letter, what he's saying is that this has been unquestioned truth for centuries. For a long time now, we've known these are the accepted books. This is not a human decision. These are just recognizing God's work, God's story. And now for many generations of Christians, they have recognized this to be the true story. That's what Athanasius is telling us here in that quotation. So again, let's look at some possible responses. What do these early witnesses say to us about these four Gospels and why we trust these four Gospels? The church of the late 1st century and early 2nd centuries were already in the process of discerning genuine accounts of Jesus. We saw that in the New Testament itself. There was a very definite concern that as we pass on the traditions, we pass on historic traditions, reliable traditions. We want our faith to be based on fact. And by the beginning of the 3rd century, it seems like we already have a majority opinion among church leaders that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were in fact the genuine authors of the books that bear their names. So these early on in the process, there's an assumption, a belief that these books were written by the people they said they were written by. They weren't anonymous. They weren't pseudonymous. They weren't pretending to be. These were the actual authors. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the books that bear their names. And this was believed way before councils started meeting and making decisions about these things. This was assumed very early in the 2nd century, it seems. And then probably by the middle of the 4th century, that is around 350, and probably well before that, we find a consistent witness to the fact that these original apostolic works were uniquely inspired, on par with the original Hebrew scriptures. Now remember, the scriptures for much of the Christian beginnings, in fact, the scriptures when the New Testament itself was being written, were the Old Testament scriptures, the prophets, the law, the prophets, the writings of the Jewish world. They were the scriptures. But what we see very early on in these first few centuries after Christ is here, these writings associated with Christ, the writings about Christ, the writings describing Christ, these writings were regarded and revered as inspired writings as well. These are continuations of the story of the Old Testament. These are continuation, inspired, truthful stories about what God has done through Jesus and how he fulfills the signs and symbols and predictions of the Old Testament. So those are just a couple responses. So let me just conclude with one final thought. And to do that, I want to look at the book of Hebrews. The first two verses of Hebrews makes a very powerful statement. It says, in the past, God spoke to our ancestors, to the prophets, at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, by whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he also made the universe. Hebrews is telling us here that God has been in the process of telling stories through centuries, and that story was to culminate in the person of Jesus. Jesus is the proof and the guarantee and the fulfillment of this revelation. He's the final stage, if you will, of this revelation. So the books describing what Jesus did, yet it's important that they're right and accurate because Jesus is the fulfillment. So what I would say by way of conclusion is something similar to what I said at the end of our study of the Old Testament. I said at that point that if you take the prophecy out of the prophets, in other words, the story that God is telling, the ability to foresee the future and predict what's happening, in my opinion, if you take away prophecy and make it all kind of a retroactive reflection, pseudonymously written text, pretending to be somebody else, you take the heart out of the Old Testament. It then really is just another set of mythological speculations. If we take the Old Testament seriously, it's about predicting the future of what's coming in Jesus. If that's historical fact looking forward. And I would say the same thing about the New Testament. If the New Testament is no longer an historical accurate record of the person Jesus, and it's some sort of later reflection and suppositions about one version of Jesus, to me, you take the heart out of the New Testament. And then again, it's just another book of mythology. We can line up with a bunch of other books of mythology and try to figure out what the truth is. No, the heart and soul of the New Testament is the historical fact that Jesus was here. He said these things, he did these things, and they are fulfillment of the prophets of the Old Testament. The whole story of the Bible is based upon this. So it seems to me that if you're going to throw that all away, and you're going to say this is just all human compilations done later in a separate way, you got to be really, really careful because what you've really done is eviscerate the very heart of the Christian faith, why we live the way we do. I don't think there's enough evidence out there to do that. I think, in fact, the evidence, as we've shown for both the Old Testament and the New Testament, proves that these are historical, or at least suggests strongly. The argument is in support of the fact that these are historical records. But come back next week. We're going to look at some of these other gospels that some people say should be included in the New Testament. What are they, and why do some people say they should be there? So we're going to look at that next week. So until then, thank you very much for joining us, and we pray that the Lord blesses you.